This is a great story. I think you're really gonna like this one. Oh, how smart I am. So I had this patient that I was really worried about, but he didn't want to stay in the hospital. And I think it was really interesting psychologically why he didn't want to stay in the hospital. I'm gonna explain that. And then there's a little kind of surprise at the end. Oh, how smart I am, and how smart I'm really not. I think I'm smart and I'm humbled. So I had this kind of middle-aged man, homeless looking guy, like his hair was out of control. He was dirty, his clothes were a mess, had these scars up and down his arms, and kind of sizing this guy up when he comes in. And he came in to me in the ER for a fever. Now here's the thing, when somebody comes into the ER with a fever, I'm worried about, they have an infection. Fever, most of the time, fever is a response to an infection. Is it a virus, which is just gonna go away on its own? Probably not a big deal. You're not gonna die from a cold or the flu. Some people are at high risk for the flu, but most of the time, those just go away on its own. You don't need antibiotics for that. You don't need to stay in the hospital usually for that. Or, on the other hand, so we got virus, fever causes a virus causes a fever from a virus, or bacteria. And if it's bacteria, that's serious. You could die from that. Can be life-threatening. And is the cause of the fever bacteria in the lung, which we call pneumonia, bacteria in your urine, a urinary tract infection, or your kidney, pyelonephritis? Is the bacteria in your gallbladder, cholecystitis? All these bacterial infections that would need antibiotics. Some need surgery, appendicitis. So I'm looking at this guy. I run some tests to see if I can find the source of his fever. Is it a virus? Is it a bacteria? That's what we're doing. His chest x-ray was negative. I didn't see any pneumonia. His urine was negative. He didn't have a urinary tract infection. Should I do a CAT scan, looking for his belly? Like, how am I gonna find the source of this fever? I did draw blood cultures where they literally take blood out of your vein and they drop it on these, sheep blood plates, and then you watch it grow. But that takes long. That takes 2 to 5 days to get a result. So I'm not gonna get that right in the ER. So I have to make a decision, even though I don't have all of this information that could otherwise help. And so I looked at this guy, and he had a fever, and his heart rate was up, and his white blood cell count was elevated, which is also a sign of infection, a little more likely bacterial. So I was like, I think this is a bacterial infection, just kind of sizing this guy up and putting everything together. I think he needs to stay in the hospital. I'm really worried that if I send him home, he's gonna die. That's our biggest fear in the ER. Like, my God, am I gonna send somebody home and be wrong and something really bad happen? Either he dies or he gets some complication where the bacteria goes everywhere and causes problems in his heart or his lungs or whatever, this is what I worry about on a daily basis. So I'm like, no, the chance is too high that this is bacteria. He needs to stay in the hospital. So I tell him this, explain all this to him, not totally sure, this is what I think, you need to stay in the hospital. And he's like, I can't stay in the hospital. And I was like, oh my God, great. Like, okay, but I was really curious. I'm like, okay, so tell me about that. Like, you don't want to get stuck with needles? Like, is your bed not, you sleep better at home? Like, you don't like the noise? Like, what is it about that? Tell me why you don't want to stay in the hospital. And he said something that was, profound. He's like, both of my parents died in this hospital. And I was like, well, that's why he doesn't want to stay. Like, it makes total sense. There's a book called The Culture Code, written by Rappel Clotaire or something like that, is the dude's name. Incredible book. And in it, he talks about how let me make sure that's not me that they're paging. In this book, he talks about how our first, that the emotional meaning that we have behind certain things is based on 3 things. Number 1, this is the imprinting. Number 1 is the first time that we experienced something. So for this guy, the first time that he experienced a hospital may have been when his parents die. I think for a lot of us, it's when our grandparents die. And so we learn that what the meaning of hospital, or like the code for hospital, is death. Hospital is a place you go when you die, because that's our first experience of it when we're young, and we go there because our grandparents or parents are sick or dying. So the 3 things are the first experience, the imprinting, the most emotionally charged or intense experience, and then your latest experience, the most recent. So this guy had told me that his most emotional experience with the hospital was how both of his parents had died there. that's in the reptilian brain. That is deep down there in the emotional things. It's gonna be very difficult for me to reason with him to stay in the hospital. I recognize this. So I try all these different techniques, all these different kind of psychological things, sales techniques. I'm like, let me see what's important to him and see if I can negotiate with that. Let me see if I can scare him a little bit. Oh, I don't want you to die. Oh, I don't want you to have to keep coming back to the ER. Let's spend a couple days in the hospital and fix this so that we take care of it later. Like all of these things, none of them worked. He was still so persistent. He's like, I'm going home. So he had to sign out. Like I was worried. I'm like, this guy's gonna die. Like he's gonna go, he's gonna leave, his fever's gonna get worse. The infection is gonna spread and it's gonna kill him. So he left. I didn't see him. A week later, he came back. Still had the fever. He was even sicker. And at this point, I had my blood culture result. And so I looked back and the blood culture was positive for a staph infection called MRSA or MRSA. You've probably heard about that before. So he had that in his blood and that's what I was worried about. Now, I'm gonna give you the punchline in a second about how smart I am, and I'm really not that smart. MRSA, what is MRSA? You've probably heard about it before. Oh my God, it's MRSA, the world's ending. Look, MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. Staph aureus lives on our skin. It's a normal bacteria that normally doesn't cause problems. Whenever you get little cuts in the skin, it can get underneath the skin and cause infections in the skin. That's a staph infection. It's a cellulitis. It's a skin infection when normal staph bacteria gets under the skin, causes an infection. It can also get through the skin. It causes an infection in your blood. That's also a staph infection in the blood. Methicillin resistant. That's the MR of MRSA. What does methicillin sound like to you? Methicillin. Penicillin. Methicillin resistant, penicillin resistant. All that means, MRSA, is that penicillin doesn't work to treat that staph infection. That's it. That's all it means. Big deal. It's a little bit difficult. We have to adjust antibiotics and give different ones. We have plenty of antibiotics that take care of MRSA. Figure out that he has MRSA in his blood. He still has a fever. He's even sicker than before. He absolutely needs to stay in the hospital this time, right? So we start having this conversation again. And I say, you really need to stay in the hospital. And then it comes out why he really didn't want to stay in the hospital, which I can't believe I didn't think of this before. Here's me thinking how smart I am. Oh, it's his imprinting because his parents died in the hospital and he's just got this, visceral, limbic, reptilian brain fear of the hospital, which may also be true. He's an IV drug abuser. He shoots IV heroin. He still shoots IV heroin. When you take a needle and you push it, when you have bacteria on your skin and you push a needle in through the skin, you push a little bit of bacteria into the blood. You do it over and over and over and over, and eventually you're gonna get bacteria in your blood. That bacteria is gonna grow in your blood, and then it's gonna stick onto your heart valve, and you're gonna get what we call endocarditis, where there's a little bit of bacteria that are stuck on the valve that takes 6 weeks of IV antibiotics to treat. So this guy was a heroin user. That's why he didn't want to stay in the hospital, because he wanted to leave so that he could go use heroin. Shows you how smart I was. And he got here and I looked at his arms and he had so many scars from skin popping where, talk about heroin for a minute. You take a needle, heroin users access a vein, shoot up. Heroin's got this incredible euphoria, 15 times the dopamine of baseline. Sex gives you like a 2x. Heroin's like 14, 15 times. It's like the most ridiculous high out there is. So I've heard. He's like, shoot in, you shoot, you get high in like 20 minutes, it stays with you stay high for hours, but it really hits you for about 20 minutes. But then once you do this for a long term, your veins get hard, they sclerote, you can no longer access them. And so these guys will go through every vein in their body that they can get to get that drug. And when that's done, then they just start sticking it in their muscling it. You just inject it right in the muscle. You still get high. It's probably not as good of a high, but then you can get infections. So So he had just up and down his arms and had infections and scarring and all this stuff. And I'm like, looking at that, I'm like, oh my gosh, what an idiot. Like, that should have been the first thing that I was thinking when he had a fever, looking at his arms, that this was endocarditis. Shows you how smart I am. But this time he agreed to stay, and he, I said, no shame. I'm not the cops. You're not their principal. But let's honestly talk about why you have this infection, which is IV drug abuse, and what's going to happen if you go home, which is you're absolutely at risk of dying, or your heart valve is going to continue to get eaten away by this bacteria until that no longer works, and then you're going to die from that. And it definitely was life-threatening, but and these heroin guys are challenging. So anyway, I think a couple of the takeaway points are thinking about how imprinting and how what your emotional code for certain things is based on the first experience, the most intense emotional experience, and your most recent emotional experience. I guess the other point is a little humility in the face of reality. Difference between bacterial, viral things, about when you need to stay in the hospital, the consequences of if you don't. A lot of good lessons here. Hoped you liked today's story. I'll see you next time.